I want to share a couple of thoughts with you about our Torah portion this week. In the portion, there is a story that's exactly the right kind of story that I love to teach about the most, because it has the combination of two critical traits. One, very few people know about it, and two, it's really strange. So let me tell you the story. The background to the story is that while wandering in the desert, the Israelites have begun talking badly about Moses, slandering his leadership abilities, and just sort of generally gossiping about him behind his back, suggesting that it was a big mistake for him to have brought them out of Egypt in the first place, and suggesting that maybe they all would have been better off if they had stayed slaves. So God, taking this sort of slander very seriously, punishes the Israelites by sending snakes to bite them. And many of them get very ill from the snake venom. And so God teaches Moses a cure. God says that if Moses will make a metal sculpture of a snake and mount it on a pole and hold it up high, then whenever someone gets bitten by a snake, he just has to look at the statue and he'll be healed. The end. Weird story, right? Right. Now, besides the weirdness of the story, what I want to talk about is that the story is interesting to us because it appears to challenge, if not completely undermine, the second commandment, the one about making graven images and treating them as though they have superhuman power. Idols are a big no-no in Israelite religion and in Jewish religion as well, so for Moses and the Israelites to make a snake statue mounted on a pole and carried around with them, well, that should make us feel a little curious and a lot uneasy. We can be reassured by knowing that we're not the only ones for whom this story is very troubling. Later on in the Bible, the book of Kings tells us that King Hezekiah ordered that the snake statue should be destroyed because it would be leading the Israelites into temptations toward idol worship. But if we rely on the Bible's timeline of events, that event wouldn't have taken place for several hundred years after the original commandment to make the snake sculpture, which means that the Israelites kept and nurtured and carried with them this magical sculpture for centuries, this magical statue of a snake that would heal and reassure them at times of suffering. So now the story has become even more curious and troubling. Now, hold that thought, and I'm going to shift gears for a moment to talk about Israel, to talk about the news this week from the Western Wall and the news that emerged from the Knesset. If you've been following the news, you know that there was a very significant decision that came out from the Netanyahu administration in the parliament this week. The background to this story is that about a year and a half ago, the Israeli government agreed to move forward with an agreement to expand access for non-Orthodox worshipers at a new section of the Western Wall, and that they would solidify the oversight over that section of the wall by placing it in the hands of a new joint commission that would be comprised of representatives from the Reform and conservative movements and other progressive Israeli religious entities. Well, the compromise that was struck in 2016 wasn't perfect. It would have still meant that services where men and women would pray together, where women could read Torah, and where talitot and tefillin would be limited to a very small section of the wall, off to one side, lower down, and secluded from the main Western Wall that most of us visit on our trips to Jerusalem. Nevertheless, the deal was generous, and the deal was solidified, and the proposed egalitarian section of the wall was designed to be just as beautiful and accessible as the existing gender-segregated sections of the Kotel. Since that agreement was made in early 2016, some progress was made toward concluding it. There was a temporary raised platform that was built. An entryway to the egalitarian wall was created through a different gate of the old city. It wasn't perfect, but much of the global Jewish leadership, including myself, by the way, agreed that it was a hopeful and helpful compromise, that it was a strong, encouraging step toward a final status of what the Israeli government called one wall for one people. But this week, the announcement came that following an unannounced secret vote, the administration would be halting all progress toward that proposal and would immediately begin reversing its commitments to provide mixed-gender worship and provide beautiful and accessible opportunities for non-Orthodox Jews at the Kotel. Predictably, the response was swift and pointed from all around the world. There was a first stinging rebuke from Natan Sharansky's Jewish Agency for Israel, followed quickly by condemnation from Jewish organizations like the JFNA and the AJC and many others. The Reform and Conservative movements spoke up. Jewish charities and educational and Zionist organizations have all issued statements and declarations reaffirming their commitment to a pluralistic Israel and to the agreed-upon plan for one wall, for one people. Now, I want to make one thing clear before we move toward an analysis of what happened this week. I want to make it clear that I don't think that the Prime Minister made this step because he looks down on Reform and conservative Jews in America. Some people feel that way, but I do not. It seems to me that this Prime Minister has always valued his relationship with the United States and with the Jewish world more broadly. But what can't be denied is that he is very strategic about his coalition politics. To me, it seems clear that he reversed his commitment on the Kotel because to follow through with it would have meant that he would lose the support of the religious parties who comprise his coalition at a time when its future is in question. This was, it's clear to me, a political move more than a religious one. And so I want to talk about why the situation matters, but before I do that, I want to identify a few of the reasons why I don't think it matters. I don't think it matters because the Kotel is the most important issue facing American Jews and Israeli Jews. Questions about peace with the Palestinians, about the threat from Iran, from the poverty suffered by Holocaust survivors and urban youth in Israel, the future of new graduates struggling as they enter the Israeli workforce. To me, all of these things are more important to Israel's future than the status of the Kotel. I also don't think it's important because by entering into this struggle, we'll find ourselves in common cause with everyday Israelis. It's abundantly clear that the vast majority of Israelis really don't care all that much about the Western Wall. Other facets of Jewish life are much more important to them and much more relevant to their daily lives, like the status of their marriages and divorces, about parenthood and conversion, about immigration and military exemptions, and so on. Most Israelis, to be blunt, would be perfectly fine with a final status agreement in which they had less access to the Western Wall. Finally, I don't think this issue is important because the Kotel is vital to our religious belief or practice. We Jews, and especially we Reform Jews, are not praying for the sacrificial cult to return or meditating hopefully for a third temple to be built on top of the Temple Mount. We're not longing for the return of animal sacrifices or a hereditary priesthood or for the elimination of synagogues and other institutions of Jewish life in the diaspora. The wall is a wall. But on that note, let's return to the story from our Parsha about the statue of the snake. We know that the veneration and worship of metal statues is far outside the parameters of normative and acceptable Jewish religion. But given that fact, why is it that the copper statue of a snake stayed with the Israelites for so long? Why did they carry it with them through their battles and their wanderings, through their settling and unsettling and resettling throughout the Promised Land? Why were they so attached to it? So attached that the Bible suggests they eventually began offering sacrifices to that metal snake, forcing their king to have it destroyed. One answer comes from the rabbis of the Mishnah, who write, when discussing the metal snake, suggesting that the reason the snake worked, the reason it functioned successfully as a cure for snake bites, is that for the Israelites it served as a symbol of the time when they struggled and made their way through with God's help. The reason that they were healed when they looked at it, the rabbis suggest, is that by elevating their eyes to see the snake on the pole, They lifted their vision and opened their hearts to God who is in heaven. So that symbol for the ancient Israelites was a combination of memory evoker and a reminder of the holiness and hope and redemption that lie in God. It wasn't a God itself. It was a symbol of God's presence. But symbols are very important. In a way, the Western Wall reminds me a little bit of that copper serpent on a stick. We know today about Judaism's opposition to idols and to the suggestion that relics or amulets or statues or walls have divine characteristics or divine power. Like all idols, there is a risk that Jews will fall into the mistaken conclusion that the wall has magic powers, that the wall itself is a divinity of sorts, that by placing our fingers or our lips or our notes in its cracks, we will win God's favor. But just like that metal serpent in the desert, although the wall is just a symbol, it's an important one that reminds us to look up and turn our eyes and hearts to God. That's ultimately why it's important to me that we reinforce and advocate for our commitment to equal access to the wall. Not because praying to the wall is a central part of our spirituality or theology, but because all of us need those stones in our lives. We need the reassurance of their solidity and their structure that reminds us to look upward and inward in our Jewish lives today. So the solution to the crisis of the Kotel isn't to disengage from our Zionism, isn't to turn our backs on Israel or its government. It never is a workable solution to do those things. So what I'll be doing in the days and weeks ahead, and I invite you to join me, will be doubling down on my commitment to learn more, to know more, to talk more, and to give more. To learn more about the proposed plan for equal access at the Kotel, to look at pictures and documents and sketches, do a virtual tour of the Kotel using the immersive technology online that allows you to walk down the wall one step at a time and see what the proposal would look like. Read the statements and the requests that have come from Jewish organizations, especially the ones you support and are allied with. Support equal access to the Kotel through gifts of tzedakah to organizations working for religious liberty in Israel. Take a few minutes and find out what policies and allocations will be undertaken by your favorite Jewish charities. Talk to me, talk to each other, talk to those organizations which represent us here and in Israel. We're still very much in the early stages of the discussion and negotiation about the future of the Kotel. The feelings are still running high and tensions are running higher, and there is no certainty yet about what the future of the Kotel plan will look like. Nevertheless, I pray that the Kotel will remain in its central position in our hearts, in our Zionism, and in our Jewishness, that those walls will remain steady and solid in our lives, in our belief, and in our connection to the Jewish state. Shabbat Shalom.